I noticed the first voicemail at 2:17 a.m. Not because it rang, but because my phone vibrated just enough to wake me from a dream where I was standing in a hallway listening to someone breathe behind a door I couldn't open. And when I glanced at the screen, the notification didn't make sense at first, because the contact name was Evan, and Evan hadn't spoken a word in 7 years. I sat up slowly, heart already tightening in a way my body seemed to recognize before my mind did, staring at the phone as if it might correct itself if I waited long enough. Because parents learn to hope for corrections even when the evidence has long since hardened. But the notification stayed, stubborn and quiet. And when I tapped it, my fingers felt numb, like they didn't belong to me anymore. The voicemail was only 6 seconds long. No time stomp glitch. No static. Just a small waveform and the play button, waiting. I didn't press it right away. I listened to the house instead, to the familiar night sounds that usually kept me anchored to the present. The refrigerator hum, ticking clock, the soft settling of old wood. Everything sounded normal. That should have reassured me. It didn't. I pressed play. Dad. That was it. One word, soft, unsure. My son's voice. Not a recording from years ago. Not the high, thin sound of a toddler. This was Evan at 9 or 10, the age he was when the doctors said he might start speaking again if we were lucky. The age frozen in my memory like an unfinished sentence. My breath hitched so hard it hurt. I replayed it again. Again, each time the same 6 seconds. The same careful hesitation. The same way he used to say Dad, like he was testing whether the word still worked. My hands started to shake. I checked the contact details, the call log, the carrier time stamp. Everything looked clean, normal, impossible. I whispered his name into the empty room before I could stop myself, and the sound of it felt wrong in my mouth. Like I'd broken a rule I didn't remember agreeing to. Evan had stopped speaking the winter after the accident. No head injury. No physical trauma. Just silence. Sudden and complete, as if someone had flipped a switch inside him and left it off. The specialists used careful language and softer voices when they talked to me, said words like selective mutism and trauma response, but none of them could explain why my son's eyes went blank whenever I asked him what he'd seen that night, or why he flinched whenever water moved too suddenly, or why he started sleeping with his hands over his ears like the world was too loud even when it was perfectly still. Over time, the silence became our normal. We learned to communicate with notes, gestures, small smiles that carried more weight than words ever had. I told myself that was enough. Parents are good at convincing themselves that. Survival is the same thing as healing. The second voicemail arrived the next night. This one was longer. 12 seconds. I didn't sleep waiting for it. Just lay there staring at the ceiling until my phone buzzed softly against the mattress. The vibration traveling straight into my chest. I played it immediately this time, fear and hope tangled so tightly I couldn't tell them apart anymore. Evan's voice was closer now, clearer, like he was leaning toward the phone. Dad, he said again, and then a pause, a small breath. It's loud here. I sat up so fast the room spun. Loud where? My mind filled the silence with images I didn't want: hospital corridors, school hallways, dreams. But before I could spiral, the message ended. 12 seconds. No background noise, no echo. Just his voice placed carefully into the dark like a breadcrumb trail. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not Evan's therapist, not the one friend who still checked in on me out of obligation and guilt. The letters had taught me something years ago, something I carried forward without fully understanding it at the time. Some things get worse the moment you give them an audience. Instead, I started paying closer attention to Evan during the day, to the way his shoulders tightened when the sink ran too long, to the way he stared at the lake across the road from our house without ever quite focusing on it, as if he were looking through it instead. When I showed him the phone, asked him gently if he'd left me messages, his eyes flicked to the screen and then away, hands moving faster than usual in his notebook. Not me, he wrote. Don't answer back. The pencil pressed so hard it snapped. My stomach dropped. Why? I asked, my voice barely steady. Evan didn't write right away. When he did, the letters were shaky. Because it learns, he wrote. and it likes your voice. The third voicemail came while Evan was asleep. This one was longer still, almost half a minute, and something in me already knew it would be different before I pressed play. "Dad," the voice said, and it was still Evan's, still perfect. But now there was something else braided through it, a faint distortion like sound traveling through water. "I found the place you told me about, the quiet one." But it followed me, chills spread down my spine. I had never told Evan about a quiet place, at least not that I remembered. The voice continued, softer now, conspiratorial. It says, "You promised." The message cut off abruptly like someone had pressed stop mid-sentence. I sat there shaking, my mind racing backward through years of conversations, nights, routines, searching for a promise I couldn't find but felt certain I'd made that night. The dreams returned with a clarity I hadn't felt since Evan first stopped speaking. I dreamed of the lake again, the one across the road, but not as it was now come, contained, ordinary, but swollen and dark. The water line higher, closer to the house, lapping at the steps like it was impatient. I dreamed of Evan standing at the edge, older than he should have been, speaking fluently and urgently to someone I couldn't see. I tried to call out to him, but no sound came from my mouth. When I woke, my throat was sore like I'd been screaming all night. My phone lay face up on the nightstand. No new messages. Just my reflection in the black screen, looking back at me like it knew something I didn't. The fourth voicemail arrived during the day. I was in the kitchen, Evan at the table working through a puzzle book, when my phone buzzed. His head snapped up instantly, eyes wide, pencil frozen midline. I didn't answer it right away. I watched him instead. He shook his head once, small and decisive. "Not here," he wrote quickly, sliding the notebook toward me. Later, I nodded, my chest tight, and put the phone face down. We sat there in silence that felt heavier than usual, both of us listening to something just beyond the edge of hearing. When I finally played the message hours later, alone in the car with the doors locked, Evan's voice sounded tired. "Dad," it said, and my heart cracked at the familiarity of it. "You need to remember the rules. You said if it ever used my voice, it meant the boundary was breaking." My breath caught. Rules. Boundary. These weren't words a child should have known, let alone used like this. "You said the lake was only quiet if we stayed quiet too," the voice continued. "You said names make it stronger." I sat there shaking, the engine idling, staring out at the water through the windshield. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like nothing had ever happened there, like it had never taken anything from us. That's when I noticed the final detail, the one that turned my blood cold. At the very end of the voicemail, beneath Evan's voice, there was another sound. Not static. Not wind. A slow, wet inhalation, followed by a second voice trying, and failing to sound like my son. "Dad," it echoed, wrong and eager. "Answer me." Drop the phone. It clattered against the floorboard, the sound too loud in the confined space. My hands trembled as I covered my ears, a useless reflex, because the real sound wasn't coming from the speaker anymore. It was coming from the lake, not waves, not movement. A low, patient pressure, like something leaning closer, waiting to see what I would do next. I thought of Evan's notebook, of the snapped pencil, of the way he'd written "don't answer back" like a warning and a plea. I understood then that the voicemails weren't a miracle or a breakthrough or a sign of healing. They were a test, a question disguised as hope. And whatever was asking, it already knew my weakest spot. My phone buzzed. Again, another voicemail, longer than the last.
I
Didn't play it, not yet. I sat in the car for a long time after that last vibration faded. My hands locked around the steering wheel as if letting go would mean answering without meaning to. Because I finally understood that whatever was calling me didn't need my voice to hear me. It needed my consent, my attention. The tiny act of recognition that parents give instinctively when their child speaks their name. And that instinct was exactly what it had learned to wear like a mask. When I finally drove home, the house felt smaller, compressed. The walls listening the way they do when you're about to say something you can't take back. And Evan was already asleep, curled on his side with his hands over his ears, like he'd been doing since the accident. His notebook open on the nightstand beside him, pencil resting across the page as if he'd been interrupted mid-thought. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have, watching his chest rise and fall, memorizing the quiet version of him, the way you memorize a shoreline before a storm. And that's when I noticed the new writing on the page, fresh enough that the graphite still caught the light. If it sounds like me, it's not me. If it asks you to answer, don't. If it asks you to come closer, run. My throat tightened. These weren't rules a child invents. These were survival notes. And worse, they were notes I had clearly taught him at some point and then erased from myself. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone face down, counting breaths, listening to the clock tick its way toward morning. And when the voicemail arrived at 4:03 a.m., I let it buzz until it stopped on its own, my pulse pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the house awake. I knew better than to play it. I also knew better than to pretend it wouldn't keep coming. When dawn finally smeared gray light across the windows, I made coffee I didn't drink and watched the lake through the glass. The surface flat and polite, the kind of stillness that pretends it has nothing to hide. Evan woke quietly and joined me without a word, sliding into the chair across from me with his notebook already open. Eyes flicking from the phone to the window and back again. I tapped the table twice, a signal I didn't remember inventing, but he responded to instantly, nodding once. "We don't answer," he wrote. "We remember the rules." I swallowed. "I don't remember them," I said softly, and his pencil paused. He looked at me then with an expression too old for his face, and he wrote, "That's why it picked you." The truth came back in fragments that morning, not as a single revelation, but as a series of pressure points, each one aching when touched. I remembered standing by the lake years ago, not in panic but in negotiation, Evan beside me and silent even then. His small hand wrapped around mine so tightly it hurt, and I remembered understanding that the quiet he'd fallen into wasn't emptiness, but compression. Like sound trapped under ice. It's because he could hear something the rest of us couldn't. The accident hadn't stolen his voice. It had opened a door he didn't know how to close. I remembered learning the rules the hard way, how names pulled it closer, how repetition strengthened it, how answering out loud taught it cadence and rhythm and made it better at pretending, and I remembered choosing the worst option because it was the only one that worked, letting myself forget so completely that I could live near the lake without constantly feeding it. Evan had paid for that choice with silence. I had paid for it with ignorance. And now the balance was shifting. The voicemails escalated as the day wore on, not in frequency, but in confidence. The pauses shorter, the tone steadier, the mimicry more precise. As if it could sense the way my resolve wavered whenever I glanced at my son. One message came through while Evan was in the shower, steam curling down the hallway like breath, and I heard his voice say, "Dad, it's okay now," with a calm that made my skin crawl, because calm was its favorite trick. Another arrived while I was taking out the trash, the phone buzzing against my thigh, the voice closer than ever, whispering, "You promised you'd come when I called." Each time I resisted the urge to answer, to correct, to explain, because every explanation is an invitation. But the restraint felt like tearing muscle from bone. Loving a child teaches you to respond. This thing had learned that lesson too. By late afternoon, the lake began to change. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone passing by would notice, but the reflections lagged just a hair behind the sky. Clouds sliding a fraction of a second too late, like the water was buffering. Evan noticed immediately. He stood at the window, shoulders hunched, and wrote without looking down, "It's closer." My chest tightened. "How do you know?" I asked. He hesitated, then wrote, "It's using less of me." I stared at the words until they blurred. Less of him meant it didn't need his voice as much anymore. It meant it was getting what it needed elsewhere. It meant me. The final voicemail came just after sunset. The sky bruised purple and orange, the house humming with a pressure that made my teeth ache. I knew it was the last because the phone didn't just vibrate. It rang a sound I hadn't heard in months, cutting through the room with surgical precision. Evan's head snapped up. His pencil fell from his hand. He shook his head hard, panic flaring in his eyes. "Don't," he wrote, the letters tearing the page. "It's lying." I picked up the phone anyway, not to answer, but to stop the ringing before it taught itself another sound. And my finger hovered over the screen as the ringing ceased on its own, replaced by the voicemail notification. I didn't T-play it. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of it pressing against the room. Could feel the lake leaning closer like a listener at a keyhole. I went to the door and opened it. Stepping out onto the porch with the phone in my hand, the night air cold and sharp in my lungs. The lake glimmered darkly across the road, patient and expectant. And for the first time since the messages began, I understood that avoidance wasn't going to be enough anymore. Silence had kept us safe, but silence alone wouldn't close what was opening. I turned to Evan, who had followed me out without a sound. Notebook clutched to his chest, and I crouched to his level, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "You were right," I said, my voice steady in a way it hadn't been all day. "It's learning." And it learned from me. His eyes shone with fear and something like relief. "So what do we do?" he wrote. The answer came not from the past, but from the rule. I'd never written down because it terrified me too much to name. You don't starve a thing like this by refusing it completely. You starve it by giving it the wrong food. I walked down to the edge of the road, close enough to the lake that I could feel the cold radiating off it. And I held the phone up, not to my ear, but out in front of me like an offering. My heart hammered. Evan cried out silently behind me, his hands fluttering, but I raised one finger to my lips, a promise and a warning. "You want my voice," I said quietly, not naming it, not shouting, not pleading. The surface of the lake rippled in response, eager. "You learned it because I gave it to you," I continued, careful to keep my tone flat, uninteresting. "But you didn't learn everything." The phone vibrated once, hard, and for a split second, Evan's voice spilled out on its own, saying my name the way it always had, and the sound tore at me like a hook. I didn't answer it. Instead, I spoke over it. Not louder, just steadier. "You learned love," I said. "But you didn't learn restraint?" The lake bulged, a slow, heavy movement beneath the surface. And the voice on the phone shifted, slipping, the mimicry cracking. "Dad," it said, "wrong now, too close, too many echoes stacked on top of each other." I forced myself to keep going. "You learned my son's voice because you thought it would bring me closer," I said. "But it doesn't belong to you, and you can't keep it." The water shuddered. The air felt thick, charged. I lifted the phone higher, my arm shaking. "You want something to answer you," I said. "So answer this." And I did the one thing I had avoided since the first voicemail arrived. I told the truth without feeding it the shape it wanted. "My son doesn't speak to you," I said. "He never has. He never will. And you don't get to use him anymore." For a moment, nothing happened. The lake went still. The phone went quiet. I thought, foolishly, that it was over. Then the pressure hit, a wave of soundless force that made my knees buckle. Memories clawing at the edges of my mind, the thing beneath the water trying to pull my attention inward, toward fear, toward love, toward the easy response of saying a name. I clenched my jaw and thought of Evan's notebook, of snapped pencils and silent rules. I held on to the only leverage I had left, refusal without denial. "You can listen," I said, "but you can't speak." The words tasted strange and final. The lake convulsed, the surface tearing into concentric rings that raced outward and dissolved. And the phone went dead in my hand, the screen dark and inert. The aftermath was quiet in the way exhaustion is quiet, the kind that follows a long illness rather than a sudden cure. Evan sagged against me, shaking, and I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the solid, ordinary warmth of his body, the reality of him anchoring me to the present. We went inside together. I turned the phone off and put it in a drawer, not as a superstition, but as a boundary made physical. And we sat at the table until the house stopped humming. That night, Evan slept without his hands over his ears. I lay awake anyway, listening. Not because I expected it to return immediately, but because vigilance had become a language. I finally remembered how to speak, In the weeks that followed, the lake behaved itself. Reflections matching the sky again, the air lightening. The house relearning the sound of ordinary living. Evan didn't start speaking overnight. Healing isn't a switch. But one morning, as we were walking past the water on our way to the mailbox, he stopped, looked at me, and said, very softly, "Dad," testing the word like he used to, and I felt my eyes burn as I nodded and answered him without fear. The phone never rang again. Sometimes late at night, I still feel the urge to listen harder than necessary, to check reflections for lag, but I've learned the final rule now. The one I should have written down years ago. Some things don't go away because you defeat them. They go away because you stop teaching them how to stay.